Welcome to episode 2 of the Accessibility Craft Podcast, where we explore the art of creating accessible websites while trying out interesting craft beverages. This podcast is brought to you by the team at Equalize Digital, a WordPress accessibility company and the proud creators of the Accessibility Checker plugin. In this episode, hosts Amber Hines, Steve Jones, and myself, Chris Hines, share thoughts on building an accessibility-first mindset and what needs to change in your approach to web projects to ensure what you deliver is accessible. For show notes and a full transcript, go to accessibilitycraft.com/002. And now, on to the show.
Hey, this is Amber, and I'm excited to be back for the second episode of Accessibility Craft. Just a quick reminder, since this is only a second episode, we're going to introduce ourselves. I am, of course, the CEO of Equalize Digital, and I'm here today with Chris.
Yeah, so my name's Chris. I am the COO of Equalize Digital, and we are also here with the man, the myth, and the legend himself.
Steve Jones. I'm the CTO of Equalize Digital.
Of course, we like to kick things off with a beverage. I am going to totally admit that I am horrified by this beverage, and I think we need to have a whole conversation about what defines craft. But Chris, why don't you tell us what our beverage is going to be today?
No one's going to take me seriously at this point, but I think that's my point, is I wanted the audience to know one thing, which is I don't take myself very seriously, and I don't think as like beverage critiquers or tasters we should take ourselves too seriously, because obviously this is just a fun little bit at the beginning. But the reason that I bought this was because we could not get the single origin hot chocolate or the nice chocolate stout before this airs on Valentine's Day. So shipping logistics aside, the other reason I chose this is because I have a strange association with Valentine's Day and Hello Kitty. And so that's where I found this. And in the way the synapses in my brain connect, I was like, oh, this is perfect. And then I bought it, much to everyone's shock and confusion.
So you also haven't told us yet what it is. No one listening has any idea. We were just saying it.
Yeah, they heard Hello Kitty, I think. So they have a clue. But I got us Hello Kitty Fizzy Pop cherry lime flavored drink. It is in a tall red can with the Hello Kitty emblem on the front, red bow and everything. And the whole can is Hello Kitty red, and I don't know what to expect. I've never had this before, but Amazon got me with this suggestion, so here we are.
And this episode is coming out the day before Valentine's Day, so if you have Prime and you get next day shipping and you need a red, ridiculous drink to drink on Valentine's Day, this is it.
There's time, yep.
There's still time.
I think we haven't tasted it yet, but I think on novelty factor alone, it's probably a good 8 out of 10.
Yeah.
So should we crack these cans open?
Let's crack them open.
All right. I want to see how red it is, so I'm going to pour mine in a cup.
Oh, you're going to pour yours?
Okay.
It doesn't look red.
I have to tell you guys, I don't drink pop ever. Like, never. I drink carbonated water, but I'm a little bit nervous that it's going to be crazy sweet because I don't drink, even though I live in the South, I don't drink sweet tea. I don't drink sweet stuff. Mm-hmm. It's not as red as the can.
No, it's kind of pinkish,
right? But I
right?
am on theme. I'm wearing a red hoodie, and it kind of matches my hoodie.
Yeah. I'll have you know, when Chris shipped this, that it came with 2 cans. And my 15-year-old daughter laid claim to the other can.
She was very excited. Has she drank it already?
No, not yet. But she keeps asking about it. You don't know what her
opinion of it.
It's going in. I'm trying it. I can't wait anymore.
All right, here we go.
Okay, it has a decent cherry lime flavor.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know what's hilarious? I think this tastes better than the fancy seed lip mixer that we had last week.
So maybe I'm on to something. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it definitely has a solid cherry lime flavor. The other thing that actually impressed me about this when I was reading the back of the can is it is sweetened with sugar and not the infamous corn syrup, which is cool.
So does that make it qualify as a craft beverage?
Oh, no. This is probably the lowest or the furthest we'll get removed from the term craft on this podcast, hopefully. This selection was born out of time crunch and desperation. Actually, I'm definitely not unhappy with it.
No, I mean, you can definitely taste the sugar.
Yeah, it's very
Mhm.
sweet.
It's
Also, I'm going to tell you guys right now, the other thing that I don't do, this is how everyone's going to know how particular I am about food. I don't food coloring, never. And I
Oh,
have
really?
tried so hard not to have our kids have food coloring. And this has FD&C Red 40, which I'm
Oh.
pretty sure is illegal in the UK because it has bad
The one
things
that
in it.
is that the one made from bugs?
No, the one made from bugs is, quote, all natural.
Oh.
This is
Well,
the one made from, I don't know, fossil fuels or something. But we're all going to be really crazy by the end of this because I'm pretty sure there are studies that this exact red food coloring causes hyperactivity, and that's why it's banned in the UK.
All right.
Oh
yeah.
my goodness.
So this podcast is going to be lit.
I'm also telling you right now because I've never tried one in my entire life, but all those like Red Bull things, those don't count as a craft beverage. We are not drinking a caffeine tea. I won't be able to handle it. I will die.
So that was the other thing, and I know I've told both of you about this before, but there is a YouTuber called Unemployed Wine Guy, and also when I saw this can in my Amazon feed when I was desperately trying to find something, anything that ties remotely to Valentine's Day that could be shipped in time, it made me think of that YouTube channel because this guy, I think he used to be a sommelier in restaurants, and he started a YouTube channel where he tries really weird or low quality stuff, but from a very highbrow sort of elevation. And I just remember the one I watched him that just had me rolling out of my chair was he tried ranch dressing flavored soda. Don't worry, I won't subject any of us to anything that
if you
that
all
crazy.
could have watched this episode, you would have seen the incredibly horrified and disgusted expression that I made. I can't even imagine. What was his verdict on ranch flavored soda?
He said it was pretty much exactly like tipping back a jug of Hidden Valley. Just like,
Only thinner?
I mean, that was the other thing about that guy is he's very witty and has funny ways of describing things. But yeah, that was Hello Kitty Cherry Limeade, which actually wasn't that bad. It's definitely sweet though.
I mean, I think if you like Sonic cherry limeades, you would probably like this.
Mm-hmm.
It tastes pretty much the same to me as what I vaguely remember those tasting like from maybe like 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
I promise my palate has evolved past this.
I think it's funny that you picked this because out of the three of us, you went to culinary school. You actually took wine tasting classes.
Right.
And you were taught how to like taste things with your entire mouth and all that kind of stuff. And then sometimes I'm shocked at the things that you eat and drink.
Yeah. That's the poorly kept secret of the restaurant and food and beverage industry is that they know everything they're supposed to know, but they eat the garbage
Right.
and drink the garbage. Like I had executive chefs who would walk in the back door with Taco Bell bags in a fine dining setting and go to their office and eat that.
Right.
Oh, wait. This is a really great segue to I've been working on our website, which may or may not look totally done by the time this podcast episode comes out, because I decided that, one, I wasn't going to have our designer design it because he's working on a lot of client stuff, and I wasn't going to have our developers develop it because they're also working on a lot of client stuff. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do it myself. And I've just been thinking I'm going to use a page builder. We'll pause on what page builder that's going to be. Maybe hold that in suspense. Or maybe this website will have a page builder by the time you look at this and you'll know. But I think that's the same thing, right? We code really intense stuff, but there are moments when you're like, man, I just want the shortcut.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want the McDonald's of WordPress themes. What would be the McDonald's of WordPress themes? Do we want to come out and say it in a public recorded forum? I don't know if we want to do that,
We might
actually.
make some enemies that way.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to call out the McDonald's of WordPress theme. I will tell you that the McDonald's of WordPress theme is probably not accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. But I bet it has delicious French fries.
What is the delicious French fry equivalent on a website? Really good content?
Yeah, I don't know.
Or graphics that are cool?
Oh, it's got to be really good content because you can't put it down. You just have to come back for one more. There's our segue. Speaking of good content, Amber, what's our subject for today? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so we are going to be talking a little bit more, extending on what Steve started talking about last week on changing your mindset. And so that you can have more of an accessibility first mindset. But I want to talk about everything throughout our entire process when we do custom website projects. And so I'm going to put you on the spot, Chris, and I'm actually going to start with sales. And I want to know, what have you done in your sales processes and your sales communications to make your sales more accessible to people?
So I think the main adjustments that I've made have to do with the initial interactions and making sure to ask, do people need any sort of accommodation for the upcoming sales call? So I try to always remember to ask that and to be ready if they do, to be ready even if they don't. So as an example, I had a sales call maybe 2 weeks ago with an absolutely lovely woman who happened to be deaf. And when we got on the Zoom, it was clear to me that she was like looking for the option to turn on captions. And so I like held up a finger. I was like, wait 1 second. And we got it enabled. And then we carried on and had like absolutely lovely call. And Amber, I ended up introducing her to you, and she writes copy and everything else. And she thanked me after the fact. And while those auto captions, or as an influential person in the captioning space calls them auto craptions.
That's Meryl. For anyone who wants to find Meryl, she is awesome and a great resource on captioning.
So they often misinterpret me. And so as I'm talking, I'm reading the captions and then pausing and then reiterating something or spelling it out with letters if the captions are misinterpreting them. Ironically, one of the number one things that the captions don't get is WCAG. Like the auto captioning tool, like it always says it wrong or like relays it wrong after I say it. So beyond that, the types of documents that I send to people to review for sales have shifted a bit. And I always say now, if I'm sending someone like a copy of a slide deck we went through, like just in case, I'll say, if you need this in like a Word format or something that works better with assistive technology, please just let me know. And if they've told me they need accommodations, then obviously that's what I send in the first place. But I think it's for my sales process, it's mostly down to just being more conscientious and more intentional in the way that I approach sales interactions instead of just rushing through it, following the script. Like it's actually harder, right? Because you have to be ready to pivot or adjust your sales process based on what that person needs from you in order to absorb the information.
Yeah. And I mean, some of the stuff applies. Like, I remember we were talking about also making sure you use meaningful links in emails, or not just posting a naked link in an email. If you're not sure if someone might be using a screen reader, you're actually linking words that mean something.
Oh, yeah. I used to have click here's in my emails, and those are gone. Yeah. Now it's meaningfully labeled. And even if I do have a naked link, it's preceded by a sentence with a colon saying what it is, which is pretty rare these days. Normally I hyperlink it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know we talked a lot about PDFs, and now we don't really have PDFs. We either send people, share a Google Doc, but Google Doc sometimes can cause problems for people. So we'll just make a Word doc for people, but also making sure that all of our Word doc or our Google Docs have alt text on the images, proper heading structure, just like a website.
Yep. No, it's good you mentioned that, because that was another thing that as we pivoted our sales process to be accessible, that was a very worthwhile but also very time-consuming process, was going through all of that, making sure all the headings were actually headings, making sure all the images were properly labeled with alternative text. And it's a lot like remediating a website. But now much like Steve, whenever he builds something or whenever we design something, which we're going to get into, like anytime I create any new sales document, I am starting with having the headings be actual headings and be in hierarchical order and have everything properly in the tool. And then, yeah, it's interesting too. It seems like Microsoft Word is the most accessible or most preferred word processing medium that people seem to ask for most often when I'm sending an alternative version of something.
If they're like a screen reader user, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. So do you feel like there was anything specific you had to do to shift your mindset to be more aware of those in your sales communications?
I think it's down to being open to change and to just learning it. And I learn by doing. So it was a matter of reading documentation on Google Docs and figuring out how to set everything up in a way that's as accessible as possible within that medium. And then I'll be open and admit too, like the biggest thing that I still need to break myself away from that is definitely not the most accessible, but that I still use is Google Slides. Like it is not very good based on all the feedback I've gotten.
All of our proposals are Google Slides, right?
All of our proposals are Google Slides, but I always offer to provide a different version and will provide a different version if they say they need accommodation. So I'm very upfront about it so that we're not presuming anything when we send it over.
And you're also not usually just sending them over. I think you actually present them, right?
Yeah, they're presented in a Zoom call and we go through the slides and it's all verbally discussed and they get a recording. So I really do try to hit it from every angle. And then even within the Google Slides, like I'm still putting alternative text on everything. I'm still trying to build the slides in as accessible a way as possible. I think the other thing that a lot of sales teams may have to factor in that may be a little bit beyond their control, and maybe this segues us into designs a little bit, is the accessibility of the color palette and how the colors are combined. If your company or your brand uses a lot of really soft colors, that may be a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, so that was one of the many reasons why we made Equalize into its own brand and didn't just, like, we were first talking about building the plugin. We had Roadwear Creative was what our company was called, and it had gray and light greens. And it was like there's so many reasons why it didn't make sense to keep that. But I remember having this conversation about our whole brand color palette, and it's going to have to change anyway. So it was like, maybe we should change the name too.
Right.
But so I think, yeah, you have to make those decisions. And then when we were sitting down and having conversations about what Equalize's color palette should be, one, we wanted AAA compliance. So we came up with a palette that allowed us to have the highest level of contrast. So it's not the minimum 4.5 to 1. It's like over 7 to 1. And then also I liked the fact that our blue is in there, and blue is the historical color for links on the web.
Right.
So it's instead of being like, oh, the links on our website are green, like they look like the color people expect links to be. Although I don't know if that's necessarily the case anymore, because so many websites do things differently. As long as they're underlined, then you're probably good.
When we're approached from a client that has a identity that doesn't meet guidelines, how have you guys addressed that?
So when I'm doing discovery with people, I use a tool. 8Shapes contrast grid is super handy. And I think we're going to try and build something like this into Accessibility Checker, and we can link it in the show notes. But I'll usually put their palette in, and what it does is it allows you to put their color codes in, and it makes a grid where they go across the top and across the left side. And then it shows you what color combinations work or do not work. So if you have a blue and a green and a white and a black, you might see that this green works on the black, but it doesn't work on the white. And this blue works on the white, but it doesn't work on the black, and the blue and green don't work on each other. We use that tool, which is really handy, because then I'll usually say, we've had instances where none of their colors work, or they only work on black. Yeah. And so then I have a conversation with them about, how do you feel about a darker aesthetic on your website? And then a lot of times they don't want that. They don't want a dark mode designed website. Right. And so then we're talking about how can we introduce other colors that are still in the same family or keep the same feel, and then using their primary. So we just launched a website, Minerva Strategies, where they use a bright orange and a bright blue. And so we added a navy. And so when the navy and like a dark maroon they went for. And so when those are there, those could have the bright blue or the orange on them, and it's fine. But then it also gave us something on sections that have lighter backgrounds. It could have a navy heading. So I think it's really just about trying to be thoughtful. And in the design, I feel like we start really even in discovery. Yeah. Talking about that kind of stuff. The colors, we talk about who the users are, what sort of journeys they might take on the website. And I think being thoughtful about that and not just moving right into, okay, these are the pages we need, is helpful, because sometimes you might realize you actually need different pages based upon what people are supposed to be doing on your site.
This episode of Accessibility Craft is sponsored by Equalize Digital Accessibility Checker, the WordPress plugin that helps you find accessibility problems before you hit publish. A WordPress native tool, Accessibility Checker provides reports directly on the post edit screen. Reports are comprehensive enough for an accessibility professional or developer, but easy enough for a content creator to understand. Accessibility Checker is an ideal tool to audit existing WordPress websites, find accessibility problems during new builds, or monitor accessibility and remind content creators of accessibility best practices on an ongoing basis. Scans run on your server, so there are no per-page fees or external API connections. GDPR and privacy compliant. Real-time accessibility scanning. Scan unlimited posts and pages with Accessibility Checker free. Upgrade to a paid version of Accessibility Checker to scan custom post types and password-protected sites. View site-wide open issue reports and more. Download Accessibility Checker free today at equalizedigital.com/accessibility-checker. Use coupon code AccessibilityCraft to save 10% on any paid plan.
So I think the other things that come up in design, I know Jacob, who's not on this call, but he's our designer. He has spent a lot of time, he's worked with us for many years, right? So he's gotten very familiar with, I know it took some back and forth where I, at one point, I was like, okay, here's a list of things that I want to never see or I want to always see. I was like, don't make headlines all caps.
Right.
Ever. I don't care if you think it looks good, if you want the shape of the letters to look the same, just don't do it, because I don't want to see it and I'm not going to approve it. And so I think it took a matter of us spending time creating some of these do's and don'ts for different things. And so that we gave it to him. And I mean, now he sends us stuff, and it's very rare that I have to go back and be like, I think this might be an accessibility problem, like in the design. So once we established what that baseline would be, and he checks for color contrast. I think he uses Stark to add to Figma and check for color contrast as he's designing. And also with content too. So if we're getting content from clients, we usually start doing training on accessibility early, so they know things. I mean, you could probably speak to this a little bit, Chris, because you used to do some of the helping them figure out how to give us content. Some of the things we would talk to them about before they even had a website or a new website. Yeah.
So one thing that immediately jumped to mind when you said that is we have an entire guide doc, and it's maybe a page or two long at most, but it explains how to put in headings as actual headings, paragraphs as actual paragraphs in our content collection system, how to label things properly, etc. And I think that helps set a baseline for entry of content in a manner that's accessible. And I think we do mention accessibility in that, but I also know that with our process at Equalize, like we approach all of it as just under the umbrella of best practice, right? This is the correct way to do this and the correct way to design and collect content and build a website. And most people pay attention to that. There's occasional pushback. I'd say the number one place I see pushback when I'm checking in on projects, even though, of course, you run them, Amber, is like colors. That's usually the biggest.
Yeah, we did that last week. My big pain point.
Is the biggest place that we get pushback is colors, people wanting inaccessible color combinations. But what's interesting too, and I remember this from a project we did last summer, was we designed something out for a customer and they said it looked flat and boring and washed out. And then we gave them a version back with higher contrast and they liked it.
But their original brand colors were the boring and washed out ones, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And so I think if people see it, and if people can see it in action, right? Because some people, I think, have trouble conceptualizing or visualizing in the abstract how a color palette and a block of text are eventually going to add up to a website, right? Like they can't really see that in their head or visualize it. And so I think it sometimes helps for them to just see it. And then they're like, oh, I get it.
I think sometimes too with the content requests, like we talk to them a lot about SEO. And we frequently frame headings. You should include headings in the content you give us, or you should give us the alt text for these images. I mean, sometimes we write that depending on the scope of the project, but sometimes they need to. Or when you're putting links in your content, make sure that they're meaningful things. We'll frequently frame it as SEO, even though it's accessibility, but it's both. And unfortunately, SEO can sell. And so then they are like, oh yeah, I got to put more effort into doing what they said instead of just, here's our non-formatted multiple paragraphs with, without headings and bad links and all that kind of stuff. So then I think the interesting thing about this probably is also the mindset on the development side. And I think you talked about that a little bit, Steve, but I'm wondering if you have extra thoughts. My last thought on that is maybe we could talk to you about the handoff from design to development and some of the things that are different when you're going to build from an accessibility first perspective.
Sure. So the handoff, I mean, over time, as we've ventured into being much more compliant with accessibility than we were many years ago, the handoff is a lot better these days with the headings. And sometimes as a developer, you want to go through those mock-ups and you want to review them, like if there's subheadings that don't quite make sense, or that if there's heading orders that visually don't make sense, you could push back before going into development. I know a lot of developers don't always want to push back. Sometimes we can be code monkeys and just we'll do whatever you give us. It's like Ron Burgundy. I'll read whatever you put on the teleprompter, right? So developers can be like that sometimes.
But do you think it's important for developers to see it and push back to the designer?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, you got to think about from a business standpoint, right? That could be quite expensive. And sometimes you outsource these to developers, right? So before you send that off, and I will say if you outsource something, there's less likelihood you're going to get pushback from them or questioning on things like heading size and stuff like that, or if they follow visual order. So us as business owners, we really need to be mindful of that before we send that off to a third-party contractor to develop it. But yeah, I mean, if I was to go through and code what I see, even though I know it's wrong, or maybe I'm just moving too fast to acknowledge that it's wrong, and I've gone through and coded this whole thing out, I've spent all this time, and then it goes for review, and then it comes up that, hey, these headings don't match or whatever. It can be costly time-wise for me to go back and recode that, right? I mean, it's best to just do it right the first time.
Yeah, I know the other thing too, that we've over time built this list of things developers did wrong. Not always you, right?
Yeah.
And now we do frequently, we'll contract out a new website build depending upon like how many projects we're running simultaneously. But it's here's the designs and here's a giant list of expectations for the designs. We're literally saying this should be a foreground image. Here's an example of a foreground image. Here's an example of a background image. Because we got instances where someone made every image a background image and we were just like, what?
Yeah.
And it's like the things that you don't think you should have to tell people, you end up sometimes having to tell people. And so I just have this giant doc that I continually add to where I'm like, here's the headings. And sometimes I'll go through the design, like where you're talking about where it's not always obvious what the heading order should be, as much as I wish that we could always consistently have, like, this is the size of an H1 and H, right? Sometimes in one section it gets bigger or smaller. And sometimes I'll go through and I'll just mark it up and I'll be like, I'll literally tell the developer, here are the headings for this page and these are the numbers I expect. And if you have to add classes, then add classes or whatever. But yeah. So what are other things on the dev side that we've changed or that has to be different if you're trying to be more accessibility first? Anything else coming to mind?
I mean, I know that we use a base install, right, which is a custom It's a custom theme that we've created ourselves, and continually evolving that to be more accessible as we find accessibility issues on our current project. Instead of just doing it for that one project, we're mindful of that, and then we're update our baseline code base so that on the next project it's not overlooked, or it's not something that has to be brought up again in testing, and being mindful of evolving that base install to be more and more in line with accessibility standards. Some of the biggest challenges, I think, in that base theme was definitely navigation. Navigation can be very tricky to make that fully accessible because you're trying to meet a lot of different things, right? You're trying to make it keyboard accessible. You're trying to make it work for a sighted person. You're trying to make it work on a mobile device, right? So it can be quite complex. And I know Amber and I went back and forth quite a bit to get that to a good place, and so every site we roll up has a nice accessible navigation. We still get requests on new sites sometimes for mega menus, and from an accessibility standpoint, that can be quite a nightmare, right? So just being mindful of that, and so like putting accessibility first, like in the dev workflow for me. It's when you're coding and you jump over to your browser to view and test what you've been doing. It's no longer just a visual look with the eyes, right? It's every time I do that now, I jump over and I start using the keyboard. I tap through it and I use the arrow keys or whatever for whatever element I'm testing is needed. And to be quite honest, I probably spend more time keyboard testing UI elements than I do visually testing them.
Oh, like versus mobile where you're making the screen smaller. You do more keyboard testing than just dragging.
Yeah, I think so. And
has that changed because of things? Is it just we have a better responsive system in our starter theme, so you don't have to worry quite as much about all the little weirdness on mobile? I don't know though, because things get created in the block editor, which not super great for mobile. But,
I mean, that's a whole nother podcast episode. Responsiveness in Gutenberg is definitely a challenge.
Yeah. But you still find that you spend more time on the keyboard testing than having to check the response.
Yeah, I think so.
CSS.
I mean, you got to think like we've been doing responsive design for 12 years or 10 years, I don't know, a long time. So there's a lot built in to our base theme. You know, we have our own SAS mix-in that we can easily define breakpoints and stuff, and that just seems to be a little more old hat these days. Very easy to do, but the keyboard testing, I'm working on a UI element like an accordion, tabs, modal. Those things you want to ensure that those are working properly.
Yeah. So I think something though that stands out there is just that you even mentioned testing, because I think a lot of times developers don't think that the accessibility testing is part of their job, and they think I code the thing, then someone will come test it, and then they'll give me a list of fixes, and then I'll go fix it.
And at one time, we thought that same way about responsive design. Yeah. I remember when we made the switch from a developer standpoint, and I think in those days I was working for myself as a freelancer, and there's a bottom line effect, right? Like I make X number of dollars to code out a website, to design, code a website. And now clients are requesting this new thing called mobile responsiveness. So now I have to basically like design this at 3-ish different viewports, right? Like mobile, tablet, desktop. Can I charge for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, and I think to some degree, I was able to charge a little bit more for that. As I became very proficient with it, I could bid for projects that were requesting that were more high dollar.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, can a developer charge for accessibility, right? And it may be hard for the individual freelancer. They may not be positioned well enough. But for a company like ours, I think that where it's our motto, we're going to do this regardless.
Yeah, and that's the thing with us too, is like accessibility isn't even a line item You won't find it in our proposals or in our invoices, like in the dollar field. It is just part of it. And there's very clear language everywhere in terms about it. Like, I'm not saying we completely ignore it in our proposals or anything. If you're building things accessibly, you should mention that, like in your proposals, right?
It's part of every line item, right?
Yeah, it's part of every line item. I mean, that's the thing. We fully shifted left. I mean, we're even trying to be accessible in the sales process. I don't know how much more left you can go.
But I think of that as micro training. Like that's what that is one of the biggest things that I think about. So this is another shift we made, which was that when we were first building websites, we'd do the sales, we'd do discovery calls, we'd make designs, clients would approve them or not, we'd make changes, right? So we got something approved, we'd build it, then we'd launch it, then we'd do trainings with our clients. And now I think we're doing a lot of micro trainings even from the like even during the sales process. Like you asking someone before you get on a sales call with them if they need any accommodations. If you do that enough times, I mean, I've had people get on Zoom with me and be surprised, like they're impressed that I have captions turned on. I'm just like, well, I just have them on all the time just in case. Like,
that woman I spoke with the other week was impressed that the option was enabled in my Zoom. I'm like, we are Equalize Digital. I think I said something like that, something corny, but yeah, it's just mindset.
I think for clients that aren't familiar with that, like seeing those things, they might be like, oh, I could do this same thing in my business. I mean, that's why our email signature at the footer of every email, it basically says, if something in this email doesn't work for you or your assistive technology, contact us and we'll try and help you. Yeah. And I've had people say the same. They're like, wow, that's really great. And I was like, you could put that in your email too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that like the training, so we're doing a lot more like small training. So like we do a little bit of training on content accessibility before we ask them to give us content, instead of at the very end being like, here's how you enter your content and this is what headings are. And right, like we're explaining it earlier in the process so that over the entire engagement, which for us, they're not short, they're many months typically, right? Like they're getting these little accessibility, I don't know, bombs of knowledge, whatever we want to call it, but they're getting like accessibility training. Sometimes that feels very explicitly like training, and sometimes that's just something they maybe don't even realize is like training, but it's something they're absorbing and going, oh, this is something we could do. And so I think that helps then with the handoff. If we're not, like we frequently don't maintain content on these websites, they're maintaining their own content. So if they've had for the past 4 months of a website project and getting accessibility over time, it makes it easier, hopefully, for them to maintain it on an ongoing basis. So I think it would be interesting to talk about how much you started to go there, Steve, when you're talking about, can I charge extra for mobile? How much extra time do you think it takes to add accessibility into a project? So if somebody has never done an accessible website build, how much extra time should they account for on the first one?
I mean, that's a loaded question, right? What are we building? We just did a project for a client where it was a realty company or in that space. That may not be exactly what they are, but so there's a full search like Zillow. There's a full search. There's many facets or search parameters and stuff. And there's lots of fly out menus and things like that. So something like that, even for us, took quite a bit of time. I mean, like, I would say on that project, I would say accessibility development wise probably took 20% of the time. I mean, that's a large amount of time. Mm-hmm. I mean, for development.
And that was just focused on like the accessible development.
Yeah, just on all these little fly out menus, all these mobiles where you're locking focus and then you're trying to set focus back where you left off. A lot of custom modals as well. It can definitely take time. I mean, I think if you're starting out doing it,
it'll probably take longer, right?
Yeah, it definitely take longer. It just depends what the type of project you're working on. If it's a basic brochure website, you might be fine. To the most complicated things you might have to deal with are some navigation issues, maybe some button issues, but it can just run the gamut. Yeah.
Yeah, I was contacted by an agency owner because I talked to quite a few of those, as you can imagine. And they said, hey, we're getting ready to build our first website where accessibility is basically guaranteed in the scope, right? And they were a little nervous and they were like, we're bidding this, we don't know what to charge. And my very basic advice to them was just to charge way more than they think they should and still plan for that project to be a learning experience project and not a profit project, and to approach it with that mindset.
Yeah.
And the next one will be the one where the accessibility is a little more profitable.
I think even on that note, like Steve's 20%, that's probably too low. If you were going to add accessibility as a guarantee to certain, and this is maybe a good thing to flag, we don't ever say that every website we build is 100% accessible. And I don't think anyone should promise that, because we import in blog posts or, I don't know, products or something from somewhere else. And I am not going to guarantee the accessibility of something that someone on our team has not personally looked at. So we guarantee like the accessibility of things we built, whether it's in the code, so like header, footer, sidebars, or any pages that were manually assembled by someone on our team where we did the content entering. But anything that gets imported from a spreadsheet or an XML file or something, I'm not going to tell you it's accessible. Right. Unless sometimes clients pay extra, like a certain number of blog posts audited and corrected. But I think like that 20%, that seems too low. If this is my first project, I don't think increasing my normal project fee by 20% would be enough. Would you double it? Triple it?
I told that agency owner, to me, way more than you think you should charge is like 50% more. So if you're charging $10,000 for a typical brochure website, charge $15,000 for your first accessible brochure website, and you're probably going to come close to making the profit you think you should make, or maybe slightly less.
Yeah. That 20% just speaks to our efficiency. So contact Chris about your next website project.
Nice.
Yeah, he'll give you a better number, which is you should always, we always say that, right? Everybody says that in our industry. Just charge more.
Yeah.
You just need to charge more. I think that this is another thing too, like on that efficiency, we're building. So we used to do template websites where we would start with a different theme and modify it. We don't do that anymore. Everything uses our same theme. And I think that is part of that efficiency with accessibility, because it's like you only had to fix it, like we talked about now. You only had to fix it once.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I think that might be it. I don't know if there's anything else that comes to mind when we're talking about building an accessibility first mindset that we should dive in before we wrap up.
Yeah, the only other thing I had was in the challenges of this, and a little bit from a development standpoint. Sometimes the challenge is that we do from time to time, we'll get requests from a client to do something on a website that we know can't be accessible. And
animated GIFs that loop forever.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, so from the developer standpoint, the request can come through. It can make it over to me, and then I have to broach, hey, this is not going to be accessible. And then I know that our mission is to make our websites as accessible as possible. But there are times where we have to do something that may not necessarily be accessible. And I know that from the business side, Chris, you have a way of handling this, right?
Yes, I do. Thank you for teeing that one up for me. So we have a one-pager that they can sign that basically says, we know we're asking for something that isn't accessible, and we're going to assume all liability for the consequences of this decision we're making, is the paraphrased legalese. Only it's a full page long of legalese. And so it looks very scary, and sometimes when they're faced with that option, okay, we'll do what you want, you just have to sign this thing. They back up, they backpedal, and they're like, oh, wait, you're asking me to sign a legal document because I'm making this decision. What? That makes it seem a little more serious to me. And I think it comes down to visibility. And so, like, for a lot of, like, high-powered executives, certainly not all of them, but we're working with CMOs, we're working with VPs of marketing, like, on these websites. They may not really think about the audiences that we're catering to when we're making something accessible. Or they may commit the faux pas of thinking that those people just aren't part of their audience. I've heard that before, right? And it's a delicate thing to deal with. And there are all sorts of different strategies that you can take to counter those arguments and to counter those assumptions. And I think we've had some recent WordPress accessibility meetups on that topic. The final thing that I wanted to mention too, other adjustments we've made or things that we've changed in our process, I think the other thing that we've done, like post-delivery on all of our websites, is we give them a full year's license of Accessibility Checker Pro, because that, like having that built-in scanning, that built-in teaching tool, and it's part of our training too, like showing them that tool and how it works, and to always look at it and to always check it as they're modifying content on their websites. I think that too helps what we build stay accessible and hopefully eventually become more accessible as they go back and look at like legacy content and update it over time. And I know that was one of our pain points that we were trying to address when we built it originally, was we build this accessible thing and then 2 weeks later they go slap a bunch of images without alt text and change all the heading structure and do all this stuff, and that completely breaks it. And we're just like pulling our hair out, like, why? No. And writing a hasty email being like, you can't do this. And having a preventive tool there helps.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think too, it's just training on why it's important. There was actually Ryan Bracey from Second Melody. He gave a talk. I don't know if either of you watched it, at WordPress Accessibility Meetup. And he was talking about he has a whole slide deck, which he presented for us, that he gives for clients about why accessibility matters. And I was very impressed, and I was like, man, we need to make a better slide deck for this for clients. But I think doing a good job of just like really making people understand the why is very helpful. And then talking to them about what their process is for maintaining the website. If it's a very large website with a lot of contributors, or like at the university, sometimes they have student workers, it's like, what can be done to ensure that those people get training if someone new comes on next quarter?
Yeah.
So that it's like really communicating that it's an ongoing thing, and accessibility is not a destination. It's a journey. It's constantly processing and happening, and you constantly have to be thinking about it in everything you do, both during the project and after the project.
All right. That's like a perfect sign off, Amber.
There you go.
All right. This has been fun. I don't know if I'm going to finish my Hello Kitty soda, to be totally honest. But we will be back. I think so. Actually, next week's episode is going to be a recording from Meetup, because people have been asking to be able to listen to those on audio. So that will be that. And then in 2 weeks, we'll be back with another conversation. And I think we're going to be talking about accessibility in Elementor.
All right. See y'all later.
See ya.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Accessibility Craft. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe in your podcast app to get notified when future episodes release. You can find Accessibility Craft on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And if building accessibility awareness is important to you, please consider rating Accessibility Craft 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Accessibility Craft is produced by Equalize Digital and hosted by Amber Hines, Chris Hines, and Steve Jones. Steve Jones composed our theme music. Learn how we help make thousands of WordPress websites more accessible at equalizedigital.com.